Eschmann's paper. This is his first semester here at the School of Social Work, so we're all going to learn a little bit about his work, which focuses on race, social media, education, and organizing. His dissertation, which he completed at the University of Chicago in 2017, explored how the internet shapes racial discourse, including the presentation of racist ideologies and the unique strategies young people of color use to engage in technology-based critical resistance. And the title of his presentation is How the Internet Facilitates Responses to Racial Microaggressions, Students of Color and Digital Resistance. Dr. Robert Eschmann.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Jacob, that was a great presentation. I've read both those papers, but I still feel like I learned from hearing you talk, so that was really good. So I'm happy to have a chance to share some of my work with you today. I changed the title of my presentation. Sorry about that. Right now I'm calling it Digital Resistance, How the Internet Facilitates Responses to Racial Microaggressions. So this is a paper that comes out of my dissertation, and this is part of a book project that I'm working on, which more broadly, explores the way that the internet shapes racial discourse. And so an overview of my talk today, I'm going to start with talking about some of my research background, how I came to this area of study, which I think is relevant for understanding how this project has unfolded. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the project so you can understand the context that this specific paper is coming out of. Talk about methods and sample findings. This is a qualitative study, and we're going to dig into some data extracts, which I think is the most exciting part about communicating research. So I'm excited about that. And then the implications for how this can help us understand how young people experience race and racism in a digital world. So broadly speaking, I study race, education, and youth development. And what this means is that for me, for the past few years, I've paid special attention to how the internet affects the way the young people learn, socialize, and resist violence and racism. So I've been involved with a number of different studies around gang-involved youth and the way that they use social media, violence interrupters, and how social media has been a tool for organizing amongst kids of color in communities that are plagued with violence. And my interest, right, so why study the internet? How did I come here? If I can, I want to step back and tell you guys a story about how I started to think about these types of questions. And so the story starts my freshman year in college. So my first semester in college, this is my first semester as a professor. My first semester in college, I played way too many video games. Maybe more video games than I did readings, right? And so when I went home over winter break, I wanted to continue to play the same video games with my cousins and my friends from back home. And so something that I didn't do at college was play those video games online. And so that's something that some cousins of mine were big into online gaming. So I spent some time at their house, and we're playing a game called Halo, which is a first-person shooter online combat game. When we're playing it online, but we're not using the headset, which means that we're not talking with the people we're playing with, which I thought was half of the reason why you wanted to play online video games in the first place, so that you can communicate with people from around the world. So I asked my cousins, why is it that we do not, why aren't we using the headset? And they kind of looked at each other and said, well, we don't use it because every time we do, we get called the N-word. And of course I didn't believe them. I said, you don't mean every time, you mean that it's happened once or twice, right? And they said, no, we mean every time. And still not believing them, I said, well, let me try this out. And when you play online video games, you don't use your real name, you have a username. And so my username at the time was Galactic Hair. And so no judgment. And so I'll never forget, right? I put on the headset to prove them wrong, and I said, hey guys, what's up? And I'll never forget the first thing that was said back to me was, your name should be Galactic N-word. And so for the rest of that game, this is the first time I've been called the N-word maliciously. For the rest of that game, just a bunch of racial slurs being hurled at me. But I still didn't believe that this was something that would happen every single time, a person of color would play video games. The way that I rationalized it, I said, you know what, we must have randomly gotten matched with some kids from Kentucky whose parents were in the KKK. This is my own perceptions at the time of who is a racist and where this language might be coming from. But played 4 or 5 more games with the headset on, and every single time got called the N-word. So eventually, I had to take the headset off, and I realized, like my cousins, that in order to enjoy, right, playing video games, in order to not be harassed, I couldn't fully engage in that, right, in that online space. So when I went back to college, and now, right, I went to a predominantly white institution, and so now I'm playing the same video game with my white friends and right in our dormitory, and now I'm thinking, wait a second, if everyone that I encountered, right, when people are behind their anonymous usernames use this type of language, is this the type of language that my friends are using when I'm not around? So what this was for me is, it was the beginning of an intellectual puzzle. So what does the style of the expression of racist language in a virtual world tell us about the nature of racism in the real world? So this isn't the question that drove me to graduate school, but it's something that I was interested in. And so while I was in graduate school, I started to build a literature review to try to understand how the characteristics of some online environments might structure a unique style of racial discourse. So what is it about the internet that structures a distinct style of racial messaging? So first, when we think about racial discourse online, this could be a variety of different things. So it can be text-based, images, audio, video-based. You have special interest sites, forums, social media, or video games. And so we're not just talking about, right, 2 human beings talking to each other face-to-face. And lots of researchers have identified the ways that we see increased overt racism in some online spaces. And so we have the proliferation of hate sites online, and the year after Obama was elected, there was an 800% increase in these hate sites. I mean, anybody who's ever watched a YouTube video or read a news story online, if you scroll down to the comments, things get ugly, right? Some explanations for this. Different norm structures online, and so, right, some of this Jacob talked about, right? So this idea of anonymity online. The anonymity can stimulate the perception that actions on the internet are separate from consequences of social norms in the real world. So the increased hostility that we see is explained by some by the online disinhibition effect, which says that the perceived freedom from societal norms by being separated by a screen, not, right, even when you're not, even if your real name is attached to what you're saying, by not having this eye contact, by that not being, right, by you not perceiving that to be a real human communication, that things tend to get more hostile or more uncivil, as Jacob was just talking about. And then cyberbullying, online bullying, is a form of harassment that may not always be based on race, but is something that people who are concerned with adolescent development have been spending more time paying attention to in the last few years. But it's not all bad. Participatory culture online. You have spaces that are less moderated, less supervised, but then we have this growth of user-generated content. So websites like Wikipedia, where you have user-generated information, have changed the way that researchers think about collaboration. And then the appropriation of technology for resistance. So Brock did an analysis of black blogs following Hurricane Katrina. And he talked about the way that black bloggers were critical of government actions and the way that mainstream media sources were framing this event and the way that it impacted black poor people. And they used the internet as a tool for resisting those dominant narratives, right? And so while mainstream media ignored the perspective of poor, struggling blacks, black bloggers use the internet as a scaffolding to support the creation and dissemination of counter-narratives that question the motives of the government and the mainstream media. And then, right, and again, Black Twitter being a hub for contemporary social movements and right, with the research Jacob just presented, and activists like DeRay being the most powerful hub of information sharing in, right, following resistance movements in Ferguson. So this is, right, this represents a big change from what we've come to, the way that we've come to think about mainstream journalism and the lack of attention that it sometimes can bring to the issues of marginalized folks. So this brings us to my current project, the Race and Internet Project. How does the internet affect the presentation of racial ideologies, and how do these distinct presentations affect young people of color? So I try to present a framework for understanding how the structural characteristics of the internet shape the expression of racist ideologies, change the way that students of color engage in racial discourse, and facilitate the development of student racial and activist identities. My data for this study comes from in-depth interviews with 38 undergraduate students of color at a school that I call North U, a private selective institution. this is something that, right, so I'm presenting data for one institution. The study, right, I've gathered data from 3 additional institutions, so this is, right, part of a research that is ongoing again. So what you're hearing is what I talked about in my dissertation. I use a sample that's recruited from student cultural organizations. I use snowball sampling so that students were able to share the study with their friends and recommend other people to participate. I advertised for the study with posters at key locations, and then I gathered data from a website called Uncomfortable Admissions at Northview. So what this was is a Facebook-based website that required students to have a northview.edu email address in order to participate, but then it gave each submission an anonymous number so that students' names were not attached. And it was designed as a space to allow students to engage in discourse around controversial topics without having to worry about the social consequences of, right, having opinions that may not be popular. But then it turned into a space that was just filled with racist, sexist, homophobic content. And so what having this online data as well as the interview data allowed me to do is to understand this dynamic of how does the internet change racial meetings in the context of a community where online discourse was not something random where you can rationalize a racist comment at the bottom of a news site by saying, oh, this is someone in Kentucky, right? And that's easier to deal with than to know this could be someone that's in my classroom. So right, the front of this website said, warning, politically incorrect area, rampant insensitivity authorized. So when I talk to students, I used a survey instrument that was influenced by Hurtado and Carter's framework for understanding institutional climate and Tynes' online victimization scale. I used Small's sequential interviewing strategy so that what was learned from each case or participant influences the questions that are asked for the next case or participant. I do thematic coding in vivo, and then I use an abductive grounded theory approach. So in line with the grounded theory approach, and for both interviews and website analysis, I wrote memos throughout the analytical process in order to simultaneously interact with both data and theory. But the abductive approach to grounded theory, right, is a little bit different. So traditional grounded theory asks for you to go into the field without any kind of a theoretical framing, and you allow the theory to come out from the data itself, and you don't want your interpretation of what's going on to be unduly influenced by your own theoretical assumptions or background. An abductive approach, however, right, so you go into the field with a theoretical background, and then you pay attention and you're looking for surprising findings that are surprising in light of what you know, in light of the theory that you're coming into the field with, and then you build on theory based on those surprising findings. So I approach the data with a theoretically informed analysis, but I also look to build new theory for understanding how the internet shapes the expression of racist ideologies in online spaces and how students of color respond to these distinct expressions. So this process of building theory from surprising finding is something that I'm going to share with you today. So for example, I went into the study looking to push back against contemporary theories of racism, like Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racists, which assume subtle, covert presentations of racist ideologies in the post-civil rights United States. So this assumption is based on the prevalence of societal norms that make overt racist language taboo. But the internet, which represents a distinct social environment with communication that is not bound by the same norms as face-to-face interaction, right? So how does the internet affect the presentation of those racial ideologies? So with the Uncomfortable Admissions page, we see an example of how the technological context of the site structured a safe place for explicitly racist language, which had tangible impacts on the way that students of color thought about race, racism, and interracial interactions on campus. But this idea that theories of racism cannot account for race on the internet wasn't the most interesting part of what I found. So I found that despite being exposed to brutal language in online spaces, students of color didn't shy away from online environments. So they didn't, like my cousins and I, take their headsets off and choose not to fully engage in the online environment. Instead, they use social media to construct spaces of critical resistance, and that's the core of what I want to talk with you about today. In 2015, the Black Student Union at California State University, LA, submitted a letter to the president calling attention to the hostile racial climate at the institution and presenting a list of demands for the university to improve the college racial environment. So amongst other demands, they asked for a new dormitory to give black students an affordable and safe housing alternative. So a year later, CSLA opened the Halisi Scholars Black Living Learning Community, described by administrators as an inclusive but non-discriminatory space. So other universities have adopted similar strategies, usually as a response to the demands of students who are fed up with negative racial experiences on campus. There are dorms for students of color at UConn, UC Davis, and the University of California at Berkeley. And then here at Berkeley, we see a student protest in 2016 where students blocked off entry to campus spaces as a way of demanding more safe spaces for students of color on campus. So the literature calls these living communities, or these safe spaces that are being asked for, counterspaces, or social spaces where students of color seek to not only avoid hostile racial interactions, but also actively participate in celebrating and affirming their racial or ethnic identities. So counterspaces can include clubs, study halls, or even informal peer groups, and they're often formed in response to student experiences with microaggressions on campus. Microaggressions are intentional or unintentional negative racial slights. They can reinforce the marginal status of people of color by questioning their intelligence, criminality, or appearance. And experiences with microaggressions are interpreted as being related to race by the targets, but not necessarily by bystanders or by the perpetrators. And we know that microaggressions have a negative impact on mental and physical health and performance at work and in school, but they're really hard to detect and respond to. So for example, victims of microaggressions report being worried about responding to microaggressions because they don't want to be labeled as being too sensitive or too militant, but at the same time feeling guilty for not responding to defend themselves or their racial or ethnic group when they are microaggressed. So the focused, we do have examples in response to microaggressions of seeking institutional support for the creation of counterspaces, such as the Berkeley protest or students asking for a new dorm. But these are examples of students organizing for empowerment. The focus of most research on microaggressions, however, is less on how students of color combat the microaggressions themselves, and instead on the negative impact of these microaggressions on people of color and how they cope. So while the latter is theoretically and practically interesting, it can reduce students of color to victims who are being acted on and who only resist the actions of their oppressors behind closed doors. So I'm much more interested in exploring the ways that students of color resist the ideologies that promote microaggressions and refuse to accept the prevalence of microaggressions as normal, acceptable, or immutable. So in this study, I explore the way that students of color actively respond to microaggressions in online spaces. I suggest that the internet structures a distinct style of racial discourse and gives students of color access to unique tools and opportunity structures for countering racial microaggressions. So two of the theoretical concepts that come out of this paper. So I find that students of color engage in the production of what I term online counterspaces, defined as online social spaces that structure critical racial discussions as students of color challenge the reproduction of dominant paradigms for understanding race, highlight and critically react to vicarious or direct experiences with microaggressions, and provide support for other students of color in the midst of what are perceived to be hostile racialized interactions. So online counterspaces are distinct from traditional counterspaces as they require less institutional support to function. They're often racially integrated. They structure a unique presentation of racial discussion, and they can be permanent online spaces but are often temporary spaces created in real time around specific racialized incidents or interactions. And then second, online racial checking, which refers to critical responses to microaggressions or racist ideologies in online spaces. Bonilla Silva suggests that speech about race-related issues will be scarce in contexts that are characterized by the dominant colorblind racial ideology. So this idea is consistent with the way that students of color describe conversations about race as being rare and largely avoided by white students. But students make a distinction between face-to-face racial discussions on campus and online racial discussions, which they say occur much more frequently. For example, Tiffany, a black female student, says, compared to more face-to-face interaction, I think they talk about it more online because I think obviously, sort of being behind a computer is much more easier to sort of articulate your thoughts. You can sort of form an opinion and sort of lay down your argument much more easily than if you're like in the heat of debate or anything like that. So here we see some of the basic characteristics of online communication, such as the ability to interact with others without being in their physical presence and on your own time, not theirs, may increase the comfort level that many students have with talking about race. So more comfort means more conversations. Tiffany continues to share how many of the online racial discussions start. The friends I associate with, they're very like activisty, So they're always sharing articles like, what do you guys think? And also here, there's a lot of academic debates. If there's anything going on in the world, they really want to talk about it and see other people's point of view. So students interested in generating discussions about race on campus are frustrated by the lack of outlets. One reason that counterspaces exist, in fact, is because issues of racial identity and justice are not perceived to be welcomed in mainstream campus spaces. On the internet, however, activisty students or students who are racially conscious or engaged have more agency in shaping and advertising racial discussions. They need not wait until the monthly Black Student Union meeting to talk about the latest Ta-Nehisi Coates piece. Instead, by simply sharing a link, they can start this discussion immediately, and they may be interacting with a larger group online than they typically would be in person. So Rachel, another Black female student, talks more about this difference. If you would take the same conversations or the same ideas that you discuss online and try to put them in the school cafeteria or the library, it definitely wouldn't be as welcoming of an environment. People seem unwilling to listen, and people usually in person like to deny that there is a race issue from what I've experienced. So not talking about race reinforces white colorblind norms and maintains campus social spaces as being dominated by white culture and norms. In contrast, when activisty students share race-related material and start racial discussions, they are creating online counterspaces. Finding these spaces is important for all the reasons that in-person counterspaces are important. They affirm racial or ethnic identities, and they facilitate critical thinking about dominant racial structures. But unlike on-campus counterspaces, which are typically populated by students of color, online counterspaces are racially integrated. The ability to craft mainstream spaces of resistance, visible to both students of color and white students, gives students of color increased agency in molding the racial climate of their institution. Rebecca, an Afro-Latina student, continues to discuss other characteristics unique to online spaces that facilitate the construction of online counterspaces. They have access to more resources to back themselves up quickly. So you can just pull up a link, direct someone towards information, being able to say, this is what I'm talking about, you can't deny this, this is proof of it. So I think there's that confidence in that you're online. So it can be hard to talk about race, not only because race is an emotionally charged topic, but also because people have different paradigms for understanding race, and so they tend to talk past one another. So for example, the dominant mode of thinking about race in ahistorical and individual level terms limits the extent to which some whites can understand the complexities of racial interactions, let alone racial injustice. Having immediate access to sources and data, in this example, gives students of color the confidence and tools to poke holes in dominant paradigms for understanding race. Rachel shares how increased access to empirical resources and time to craft careful statements impacts the norms around online racial discourse at North U. I didn't really care about grammar, but if you're on Facebook and you're talking to a mid-U person, you should make sure that you have a nice thesis, an intro, some citations. It encourages you to sit and kind of meditate on what other people say before you respond and type out a very thoughtful response and make sure you have evidence to back it up. So I suggest that it may take this increased effort, soundness of argument, and relevant evidence to counter commonly held folk beliefs about race. The normalization of formal language, evidence, and peer critique helps establish online counterspaces as uniquely capable of facilitating resistance to dominant norms around racial discussions, including silence and colorblindness. Individual level and ahistorical explanations for racial inequality, for example, may be less convincing in contexts where respondents can quickly share information about the structural or historical antecedents to various forms of inequality. Hank, a Black male student, talks about the way that online counterspaces are not safe spaces, right? So on campus, counterspaces are meant to be safe spaces for students of color, places where they can experience a respite from racial microaggressions. In contrast, online counterspaces are not safe spaces. Hank says there's a certain degree of liberation where you can say what you feel, right? And people can scrutinize you, but they're not scrutinizing you to your face. So it's not as harmful. It's not as conflicting, if you were to say something potentially controversial and people call you out on it, in class or something, and then you were forced to defend yourself, but in person. So I feel online people are probably more likely to say certain things, to give more controversial opinions because they have time to defend it and look up statistics and they are not actually face to face with the person. So the same characteristics of online communication that make racial dialogues easier to hold then also make it easier to share offensive or fringe ideas. David, a Black and Latino student, has had similar experiences. For David, the prevalence of racist attitudes online is indicative of how whites really think about race, and this impacts the way he thinks about his superficial interactions with some whites on campus. Angela, a Black female student, also believes that people are more blunt and honest on social media, even when they are not anonymous. She has this to say about reading those online posts that might be considered racially offensive. It's a very interesting way to see how people actually feel about racial issues. In many ways, it's actually kind of refreshing because people can have like really honest debates that for some reason they feel like they can't have in person. It also doesn't mean that everything that people say is intelligent. It actually means that people have no filter. Whereas, you might be a little more careful, right? Or a little bit more nuanced in front of a person. So here Angela suggests that when whites are preoccupied with not saying anything offensive, their interactions, though less offensive, can come across as being disingenuous. Even when online racial discourse becomes offensive, she at least feels like she's not being lied to. In online counterspaces, students of color are more at risk of being exposed to overtly racist ideologies, but also have access to a unique set of tools that let them identify and counter these ways of thinking about race. Furthermore, students of color have more support in online counterspaces. In person, microaggressions are only heard by people in the immediate vicinity, limiting the pool of people who can potentially respond and putting pressure on students of color to be a race representative. Not all students are equally equipped or inclined to respond in those circumstances. In online spaces, however, this pressure is reduced. Christina, an Indian American female student, explains, "In the context of the university community, when people make racial jokes, I think they are uninformed. And if I talk to them and people speak up, it's great. Because like our university is filled with people who will comment on a joke you make online and say like, hey, that's not okay and this is why, which leads to a conversation. There are people who put forth academic arguments that are flawed, and it's very hard to argue against those kinds of people. But then again, there's like an entire legion of people who exist to argue against those people. So because online racial discussions do not require participants to occupy the same physical space nor be engaged at the same time, there's a larger pool of potential respondents to microaggressions online than in person. While it is common for students of color to be the only student of color in their classrooms, they're never the only person of color on the internet. Therefore, students of color are less pressured to respond to microaggressions or to be the voice for their race or ethnicity in online counterspaces. To further this point, Jelani, a black male student, spoke about a white student who made online comments disparaging the community surrounding the university and voicing how he felt unsafe with black community members walking around or begging for money close to campus. The online response to these types of situations, according to Jelani, is consistent. There's never been a situation where no one has responded back to a comment like that. Someone always will step up, and it's not just like a black person to a white person. It's like any race will comment and start saying, what you're expressing it's stupid, and like it's offensive, and like you really need to check yourself. So while the internet may increase the risk of students of color being exposed to microaggressions, it also increases immediate access to allies and support. Being a member of a group that is a numerical minority matters less in online spaces where small groups can have a large voice. The decreased power differential between whites and students of color in online counterspaces leads to whites facing increased peer accountability for making racial slights. Rachel talks about the potential consequences of making offensive posts online. If someone says something really racist, you get a message like, did you see what she said? She's in my such and such class. And then they get side-eyed until you actually bring it up to them. That's a very, very easy way to be ostracized. You're not going to be able to still be accepted if you post something like racist or homophobic. So this outcome, whites being made to feel uncomfortable on campus or being less accepted because of their views or comments on race, is different from what we have come to expect on predominantly white college campuses. Students of color in online counterspaces have access to informal sanctioning mechanisms that not only punish perpetrators of racial slights, but may also discourage further racial slights. I use the term online racial checking to refer to critical responses to racial microaggressions or the expression of racist ideologies. So several students told me about an incident where a white student took a picture of a black male dining hall employee reading the campus newspaper in the dining hall and then posted it to a campus Facebook site and just captioned it with "ha ha." So Miguel, a black male student who reported that he wrote 15 to 20 comments in a discussion on this post, believed that the comment was laughing at the black working class man reading as if this were some kind of oxymoron. But some online users did not accept this analysis. Miguel says, people were just like, oh, no, you just don't get it. It's because someone is actually reading the school newspaper, guys, like, because no one reads the school newspaper. One guy was like, oh, I definitely think that this dining hall employee can read. Maybe the fact that you took such offense to this only shows that you have insecurities about him not being able to read. And I was like, or maybe this is just racist. So one can imagine how this joke would be more defensible in person. If the offending party was criticized for making a joke based on the stereotype that black men can't read, they could easily respond by saying, no, the joke was about the newspaper. I didn't even notice the guy reading it was black. A person of color, whether or not they believe this explanation, might concede that it was a misunderstanding. To suggest otherwise could be interpreted as defamation of character, calling the person who made the comment a liar or worse, a racist. And as indicated in the above quote, the only racist thing about this joke for some whites is the misguided suggestion that race was implied in the first place. So online, these types of colorblind arguments are less effective. Persons of color feel less alone and outnumbered in online counterspaces, so they are less likely to be intimidated into accepting that the incident was a misunderstanding. Given this increased support around their understanding of the joke being about race, they experience less uncertainty about its racial implications and, using the tools unique to the online counterspace, are better able to articulate their arguments that support their interpretation. So in this example, after about 100 comments, the poster said that he had made a mistake and deleted his original post. So while deleting the post does not necessarily signify a change of heart, it is indicative of a shift in power. For students of color, this event is not remembered as just another time that a white student got away with a hurtful microaggression or racist joke. Instead, students of color engaged in online racial checking by combating the microaggression, denying the legitimacy of a colorblind interpretation of the joke, and demonstrating that it was ultimately not welcome in the online counterspace. Elsewhere in the interview, Angela spoke about how seriously she takes posts on social media and how she believes they are indicative of how people think when their guard is down. In this example, she suggested the perceived appropriateness of the comment on the part of the original poster was learned in other campus spaces. In the online counterspace, however, claiming innocence does not absolve you of racial sins. Because the expression of racial stereotypes and microaggressions can go unchallenged in many campus spaces, this online racial checking incident may represent the first time the poster's racial ideology had been critiqued. Rachel talks about another example of online racial checking that took place on the same campus website. This one girl posted like, overthought while walking behind a black guy, what if I robbed him just to be ironic? And someone was like, what? How is that ironic? Like, so you're admitting that you expect a black guy would rob you? So Rachel noted that the consequences of the post extended to campus and said for the next couple of weeks when everybody saw the girl walking around on the quad, they're like, oh, it's her. As previously discussed, implying the criminality of people of color is a textbook microaggression. And while colleges and universities are known for making statements against overtly racist incidents on campus that cause headlines, racial slights like this, on the other hand, are more difficult to police, especially online. Even though we know that online spaces are less moderated in general, this example suggests that online racial checking can function as a form of peer-based accountability that can carry over from online counterspaces to campus spaces. So in this example, as the poster was being ostracized by many on campus, an activist of color approached the person to talk about the incident. The poster acknowledged how she was wrong and showed interest in increasing her racial awareness. And later that academic year, she came with the activist to a black student party where her interactions with students of color indicated to Rachel that she had changed the way that she thought about race. So online racial checking not only increases the extent to which white students are made accountable for microaggressing, but also may potentially be part of an effective strategy for combating racist ideologies. And in my last example, so I'm gonna skip these two in the interest of time. In my last example, Stephanie, a black female student, talks about how a student posted an article about Harriet Tubman being put on the $20 bill. A white male student responded to this post indicating that he was going to miss Andrew Jackson. A flurry of comments ensued, with many students responding by pointing out how, among other morally questionable actions, Andrew Jackson had been involved in a genocide and therefore was not a historical figure that should be honored by his face in our currency. As the student continued to defend Andrew Jackson, Stephanie says this of her own response. I commented something like, oh my God, I can't even remember what this comment was, but it was gold. It was really good. A whole bunch of people liked it, and I felt validated by the fact that a whole bunch of people liked my shaming of this guy. So the idea that a white male student can be shamed because he defends a white male American historical figure, and that this shaming garners much support in the form of Facebook likes, is a shift in how we have traditionally thought about racial dynamics on college campuses. By engaging in online racial checking, Stephanie participated in the creation of an online counterspace where dominant historical narratives were questioned. She does not remember the words she used in her post, but she remembers the social impact that it had, the support that she received, and how in that moment the campus racial power dynamics were turned upside down. Right, so just in sum, when we think about the distinct structure of online counterspaces, we have increased perceived honesty, increased perceived support. These are dynamic and changing spaces that operate with less institutional support. And then, of course, they're characterized by online racial checking, which normalizes critiques of dominant racial norms and meanings. It's a collaborative process. It's not something that individual students undertake by themselves. You have increased peer accountability and the potential for change, and then a shift in racial power dynamics in the context of a college campus. So it can be helpful to think about the online counterspaces and online racial checking as being in a symbiotic relationship. So the online counterspace setting offers alternative norm structures around racial discourse and access to support mechanisms, features that enable online racial checking. And at the same time, online racial checking sparks, supports, and sustains online counterspaces with explicit critiques of dominant racial ideologies and microaggressions. So in tandem, online counterspaces and online racial checking structure a unique opportunity for students of color to demonstrate that they are not indefensible agents who are merely acted on by whites. So these findings add complexity to the discussion of racial microaggressions on college campuses. So whereas prior research largely focuses on the negative impacts of microaggressions and students' internalized responses to these incidents, here the focus is on externalized responses, including individual and group level processes and collaborative actions taken to combat racist ideologies. So in the summer of 2017, I'm sure a lot of you read about Harvard rescinding admission for 10 students who had taken part in a Facebook-based group chat where racist, sexist, and sexually offensive content had been shared. So as many colleges and universities wrestle with the sometimes competing ideals of free speech on campus and the desire to protect students from harassment, this decision has the potential to influence the way that other institutions approach the regulation of student speech in online spaces. So we need to ask the question, do schools have the right capacity or inclination to intervene when students engage in offensive online behavior? But the findings in this paper suggest that as colleges and universities around the country decide how to navigate this thin line between free speech and harassment, students of color may not rely on official policies to determine the way that they respond to racial microaggressions. In the absence of an institutional push against microaggressions, both in person and online, students of color in this sample independently assess, critique, and sanction racial microaggressions. I suggest that to the extent that microaggressions function as mechanisms of the new racism, participating in, which is kinder and more gentler than, the old racism, which would be like a Jim Crow era racism. Participating in online counterspaces and online racial checking is radical and subversive. For just as microaggressions are interpersonal acts that reinforce racist structures, online counterspaces and online racial checking are interpersonal acts that challenge white hegemony on campus and beyond. So how can this theory, which is developed using data at one institution, be used to better understand the dynamics of racial discourse in other spaces? So outside of the college environment, some aspects of these processes will differ, as online discussions are less likely to be tied to tangible in-person communities. But these concepts can still be used to understand the distinct style of responses to microaggressions that typify many online contexts. So one example of online racial checking outside of a university context comes from the Twitter account, Yes, You're Racist, which is known for its clever responses and creative ways of shaming Twitter users who post microaggressive or overtly racist comments. An example is that in the wake of the August white supremacist march in Charlottesville, Yes, You're Racist tweeted pictures of participants in the march to its 400,000 followers, asking them to direct message the account if they recognized any of the demonstrators. So this collaborative effort between @Yes, You're Racist and its followers resulted in several alt-right demonstrators having their identities exposed and then losing their jobs. So this is not the only Twitter account that has gained popularity from its critical and clever engagement with dominant racial ideologies. I suggest that the perceived consequences of responding to microaggressions in person, fear of being labeled too sensitive or too militant, are not only lessened in many online contexts, but they're reversed. So on Twitter in particular, where movements and discussions that critique dominant narratives and structures are highly visible, users can expect that engaging in online racial checking will not bring shame, but instead it will be met with support and positive feedback from users who empathize with or share in their experiences. So far from scaring users away from responding to racial slights, these dynamics create social incentives to engage in online racial checking. The increased prevalence of online racial checking shifts the norms around racial discourse and the social acceptability of microaggressions, creating and solidifying online counterspaces. So within the distinct confines of the online counterspaces, people, and not just people of color, are more available and willing to talk about race. In online counterspaces, whites are not silent and people of color are not silenced. This shift away from silence weakens one of the more effective mechanisms of the new racism, wherein whites ignore issues of race or explain them in aracial terms. And so young people of color are empowered by explicitly acknowledging and critiquing racist ideologies that support practices like microaggressions. So online counterspaces and online racial checking have the potential to change the way that race is experienced by young people of color on college campuses and beyond. That's all. Thank you.
Not really, but we'll do some anyhow because it's a great talk. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, thanks. This was really encouraging. I kind of track some of, I guess, what I call like the white academic backlash, like people like Jonathan Haidt who really want to push campuses to stop talking about microaggressions at all. So on the one hand, I just want to say this is encouraging to see, but I guess I wonder where you see the balance in terms of students of color pushing back by creating these counter spaces, but also like how much do they feel some of the weight of this kind of like growing movement to like, we have to stop safe spaces, we have to stop, you know, and usually kind of like this denigration. It's like students of color don't know how to argue, they're just emotional, they're just, you know, backlashing. And so I guess I'm not so sure what my question is. I guess where do you see the balance in terms of like creating these kind of counter movements in subversive ways versus kind of like organized student kind of like really pushing back against the pushback at the institutional level?
Okay.
Like, do you see both happening equally, or do you see, if that makes sense?
So students of my sample talked about the type of racial events that take place on campus, seeing the same faces at every event month after month, and not feeling like these are messages that are being spread to the broader community. And so there's a frustration with some of those traditional forms of pushing back against the institution, or speaking in contexts that are institutionally, right, that are sanctioned by the university. This is the forum that we're going to have to talk about the racist frat incident that happened last weekend, right? And so it's the frustration with that kind of the failure by colleges and universities to deal with the race issue on campus that has led students to create their own spaces online. And so I don't know if you're asking what is the potential pushback against those processes. Is that part of the question, or?
Creation of these alternative subversive spaces take any energy from a need to really push back against institutional pressure to stop talking about safe spaces and stop talking about microaggressions.
Right.
Like
right.
I can see this being good, but I could also see it potentially siphoning some energy from an institutional pushback, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
So an institution saying, since our students are doing this, they're working it out amongst themselves, we don't need to.
Yeah,
we don't need to do
they're working
anything.
it out amongst themselves. We can still stop our physical safe spaces. We can still
Yeah.
cancel our microaggression training or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think so, because part of what happens, and this is something I explore in a later chapter, is that through the participation in these spaces, students start to develop stronger racial identities and identities as being student activists. And then for some students, not all, that bleeds over into the way that they interact with, with the campus, right? And so students that started by just having these conversations in their free time on their phones, walking from class to class, end up being the students that say, okay, now that we've figured, right, now that we have a more advanced way of thinking about this, how do we create change at the institutional level? So no, so I think that it has the opposite effect.
Thank you. Great.
Hey, thank you. I'm thinking about the previous speaker. How one of the things you guys have in common is you're really talking about the change in the hierarchies of power that the internet allows in terms of gatekeepers and media and involved activists and people on the ground. But you're also talking about how this is a shift in power in terms of racial discourse, right? So I'm wondering what you think of your own conclusion that you seem to be suggesting that what we need is maybe bigger, more integrated online counter spaces that invite more people to participate in an active destabilizing or reversal of power dynamics? Is that ultimately what you're?
In terms of reversal of power dynamics, I would hesitate to go that far, but I think
At least online, I mean.
yeah, I would. Yeah, I think that it seems to me that the norms around racial discourse protect white hegemony in many contexts, where because it's impolite to talk about race or to challenge someone's views that no, I live where I want to live, or that, and that has nothing to do, right? That doesn't have anything to do with me not hating someone, right? So it's hard to identify the way that racism works in a colorblind world where people can support racist policies without having any individual level of racial hostility towards someone of another color, right? Yeah. And so these spaces are normalizing the types of critique of those colorblind spaces that prior to that I think have largely been, those types of discussions have largely been limited to radical activists and then academic circles. And so this is something that you have a normalizing of kind of a critical race theory based style critique of racial power structures. And so I don't know that I would say that that's a reversal, right? But it definitely challenges whiteness in a way that's very public, in a way that I think is effective, but it's doing so in a context where you have white users who are more comfortable admitting their own problematic racial understandings, which they may not be comfortable admitting in other contexts.
Yeah, that's the part that was the most intriguing to me, that it's an integrated space, and that I can imagine this sort of thing being promoted as a larger space that invites you to participate in that slight reversal of conventional power dynamics, which normalize white racial hegemony, right? Especially those students you talked about who, are hurt by it, but then they come back. It's sort of an engaging space.
Exactly.
Really
And so the example that I skipped over was about a student who was microaggressed in person, but he's someone who felt comfortable calling out the microaggression. But as he did so and tried to start a conversation, the person who started it just walked away and wasn't willing to engage.
Gotcha.
And so then he went and posted about the interaction online, and that began a week-long conversation within the comments about that microaggression in particular and the microaggressions on campus in general, right? And so it's the ability to start conversations when traditionally students of color have not felt that they had that agency, which is why that they needed in-person counterspaces to be, okay, this is the respite when we get here on a Friday night that we can now talk about what we've been experiencing in class.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Folks, we have one more question?
Thank you. Thanks so much for this lovely talk. So I guess my question is really thinking about the relationship of discourse versus community building, because I think as someone who has waded into one too many online battles on race myself, I mean, anecdotally, I can say that very rarely do I actually succeed at changing someone's worldview completely, right? And I think that's one of the sort of the challenges about online sociality more generally. So I guess to push back a little bit, part of me wonders whether or not the role of these online spaces is really more about community building than it is actually about, kind of a Millsian free marketplace of ideas, so to speak. Because I suppose the potential danger here too is, if I'm thinking about on the other side of the political spectrum, how the alt-right was also able to consolidate through similar forms of community building, through similar forms of feeling like they were microaggressed through their, as a consequence of their sense of white fragility, for example, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm just, as someone who works with a lot of new media, but also feels like really kind of anxious about what is foreclosed in online spaces as well. So I guess I'm just trying to think about the relationship of discourse to community building in these types of spaces.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a really good point. There are examples that came out of this of there being extended conversations about affirmative action where someone who is against affirmative action after hundreds of comments saying, you know what? Actually, you guys are right, and I'm changing my mind. So there are those examples. I think more often than not, right, when people are checked and with racial microaggressions or with problematic racial messaging, that they may not be changing their attitude, but I think that them changing their attitude matters less than what it represents for that to be acknowledged and stopped in a way, whereas before it's something that is so normal that those interactions become invisible. And so what happens is you have people of color who are operating in these spaces who are not able to talk about the way that they're assailed on a daily basis. And what that right, and so and what that does to people over time, right? There's a lot of David Williams' research on everyday racism and the impact that that has on health and literally dying faster than we should as a result of kind of living in a racist world. So I think what this does is it's the beginning of being able to name those types of problematic structures in a way that. Right, but by challenging them, we're able to put forth an alternative. What the long-term consequences of that are going to be, I don't know. Right, I'm working on an essay now in terms of like around the alt-right, where I think that the alt-right is really. I feel like white supremacy is shooting itself in the foot, and that they've had this really effective strategy of hiding for the last 50 years that allow people to ignore mass incarceration and kind of right educational inequality and for it to be difficult for people to point out where racism actually is outside of academic environments. These are discussions for people who don't have the language of colorblind racism or structural inequality or institutional inequality, that people just can't grasp it, right? Now with alt-right, everybody on the left and the right is like, damn, this sucks. We thought that this died in 1950. And so for it to be brought back to the forefront is starting conversations about, or continuing conversations about race, where you have some people who are like, we told you this was here. You have other people who are awakening to the fact that we haven't beat race, we're not post-racial. And so I think that, so I don't know if that answers that question. But.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Rob.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jacob. Thanks for all the great questions. We're going to have a